Hi folks, Happy New Year. I hope you've all enjoyed the festive season and the new year is a great one for you and yours. As many of you are aware, over the past few months I've been preparing a podcast series on the Great Famine, and finally it's here. I'm really excited about the prospects of making this new series, and I thought it was worth explaining a few things about the Great Famine series before I get going. I guess this short episode is much like the introduction you get at the beginning of a book. If this isn't your thing and you want to crack on with the series, the first episode is already available for patrons at patreon.com/Irish podcast. That's patreon.com/Irish podcast. Otherwise, it will be released through iTunes, Google Play, and other podcast platforms in a week's time. The Great Irish Famine of the 1840s was a unique event, not only in terms of Irish history, but arguably world history. While it was not the most destructive famine in our past, that dubious honour falls to events a century earlier in the early 1740s. No other event, be it war, famine, or peacetime, has shaped the history of Ireland in the way the Great Famine has. Beginning in 1845, more than 20% of the Irish population had died or fled into exile by the time the Great Famine came to an end in 1851. The island had been transformed. Communities were destroyed, villages abandoned, and Irish society torn asunder. While these provide a dark tapestry of fascinating stories, it was also a time of remarkable endurance, revolt against injustice, and survival. While the series will look at individual stories from the period, it will also answer the bigger questions. What were the causes of the Great Famine? It was far more than just the story of the failure of a potato crop. I will also look at the tough questions of who was to blame, what was the role of Great Britain in these events, and who profited from the Great Famine. The legacy of these events is hard to even fathom. While the human suffering was appalling, it also pushed Ireland's relationship with Britain, one already mired in bitterness, past a point of no return. The impact of Ireland's Great Famine was also felt far beyond the shores of this island. Desperate to escape what seemed to be endless suffering and death, well over 1 million people emigrated between 1845 and 1851. In the United States, the makeup of cities on the eastern seaboard were transformed forever. The oft-quoted statistic that 1 in 4 New Yorkers were Irish-born by the 1860s speaks volumes to this. Their stories will form an integral part of the series. Britain was also transformed by the famine. The port of Liverpool alone saw over 1 million Irish people pass through it in 5 years, many of them settling in the hinterland. Glasgow, perhaps most of all, was redefined. Its politics, culture, and even sport, right down to the 21st century, is divided along identities and lines forged in the aftermath of the Great Famine. In making this series, I plan to put the individuals, ancestors of Irish people across the globe today, those who lived through, survived, or died during these events, at the centre of the series. For example, the first episode, which looks at life prior to the onset of famine, focuses on the life of the Irish revolutionary Anne Devlin. One final important note is the name of the series. I have chosen the pretty straightforward name, The Great Irish Famine, which is not without problems, but nevertheless I've chosen it for 2 key reasons. My primary aim in this series is to make a history of the Great Famine that is as accessible as possible, and listeners need no prior knowledge of Ireland or its past. Many of the 20,000 regular listeners to this podcast are people who do not live in Ireland, don't speak Irish, and would not recognise what are arguably more appropriate terms. What is often suggested as the most appropriate term is the Irish An Gorta Mór, meaning the Great Hunger, but few outside the island would know what this was referring to. Another option, and one used by survivors of the Great Famine, but has fallen out of use through the 20th century, is the term Druch Hael. This is even more problematic because it doesn't really translate well into English, as it literally means bad life or bad times, but in Irish has far stronger connotations. So, because of this, I've chosen the term the Great Irish Famine or Great Famine when referring to the event as a whole. I hope you enjoy the series, and if you have any questions, you can find me at history@irishhistorypodcast.ie, facebook.com/Irish History Podcast, or Irish History on Twitter. Finally, don't forget you can hear the first episode, Rebel Island, right now by signing up at patreon.com /Irish podcast. Otherwise, it will be released through iTunes, Google Play, and other podcast platforms in a week's time.